Boker Tov, everyone. There was an article, and I think US News, that I saw the other day when I was researching or looking up different sources for this class on the Parsha of Vayera. We are continuing with the story of Avraham and Sarah, and the children that they have. They've had Ishmael at this point, and then this Parasha, they have Yitzchak, and a lot, plot-wise, narrative-wise, a lot happens in this Parsha. All the way up through the binding of Isaac, the near sacrifice Avram of his son Isaac. But what this article was talking about is, what did it say? Something like, why are scholars so obsessed with the relationship between Sarah and Hagar? And this wasn't just talking about Jewish scholars. It was saying across the board, Muslim scholars, Christian scholars, academic ones. There's something about the relationship. People keep going back to it. And it's a great question. And one of the reasons that relationship is so important is because that rivalry, and we'll come back to, is this really a rivalry between Sarah and her handmaid that she picked and she brought from Egypt to serve her and then handed Hagar over to her husband to have a child with, that Sarah and Hagar, so they should have a good relationship. They've come to represent the rivalry perhaps between Jews and Muslims, or any familial relationships, but it just becomes this symbol for all of the conflict that the Jews have with their enemies. And going back to Sarah and how she, or Sarai or Sarah, and how she sent out Hagar. And what we actually saw in last week's parasha is when Hagar became pregnant, because Abraham or Sarah couldn't become pregnant, that when she became pregnant, Sarah became jealous. And she said, send her out. And Avraham listened to his wife and sent her out. Well, one of the things we see in the Torah is that incidents don't just end. They're connected, they continue, they build on each other. So in many ways, this week, we're going to look at the sequel to that. So that rivalry, that jealousy that began in last week's parasha between Sarah and Hagar is going to continue in this week's parasha, when not only when Ishmael has been born, but now Sarah herself is able to have a child, Yitzchak. And that's exactly where we will pick up. Is Yitzchak is very young. He's in his first few months of life, and they're having a big feast, a party, to celebrate that Sarah, who's the real wife, the main wife, has now been able to have a child. But again, unfortunately, that jealousy and that rivalry is going to continue. So that's part one, continuing to look at this rivalry. But part two is, there's a word that keeps coming up throughout the Torah. It came up when Sarah or Sarai realized that she was pregnant. And without going into Hebrew, what did she do? She laughed, tzachak. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that word means and how it's used, but we're going to see that word come up again, because the word for laughing, litzchok, if I said in Hebrew, I laughed, I would say tzachakti. And when she laughed at the almost absurdity that she was going to have a child, at almost 100 years of age, then she ended up recognizing the absurdity of it and naming her child Yitzchak, from that same root of he will laugh. And that word of laughter, which here it seems like it's, an absurd joy, it's going to take on a very, very different meaning in our first source. So again, we're going to look at that rivalry, how it plays out, and how it connects to today, why people are so interested in it, and look at a single word and how that single word, depending on where it is in the Torah, can have vastly different meanings. So Irv, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you for the first source. But before he reads, are there any questions before we jump into things? I imagine more will come up as we go through. Excellent. All right, Irv, if you would please read this first source. And again, Yitzchak has been born, and they are just having a big party, a big feast. I think that's not mentioned here. They had a big feast, and then it talks about how he's basically been weaned, and so he's still Yitzchak is a very, very young child. And as we will see, Ishmael is probably 16 or 17 years old at this time. So this is where our story begins today. Please, Irv, source number 1.
The child grew up and was weaned, and Abraham held a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. Sarah saw the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham playing. She said to Abraham, "Cast out that slave woman and her son, for the son of that slave shall not share in the inheritance with my son Isaac."
Excellent, thank you. So it does mention the feast here, and this must have been, again, if you went back in time to the ancient Near Eastern culture, there probably was some, how we have a bris ceremony, we have our mitzvah ceremony. There must have been this weaning ceremony in ancient days, but it was a day for great celebration. In the midst of that, Hagar, the Egyptian, and they don't always call her that. And the rabbis do pick up on the fact that she has her full title here about being an outsider, not a Jew, not an Israelite, nothing like that, that she's an Egyptian. And it says that her son, who is Yishmael here, in the Hebrew, if you can read the Hebrew, 4 lines, for the 4th line, 2nd word. So it says, Asher Yaladat le Avraham Metzachek. So this child, Yishmael, who again was 16 or 17, was Metzacheking. And again, we'll talk about what does that mean, but the way they translate it here is playing. There's actually a different Hebrew word for playing, which sounds very similar, mesachek. But here, metzachek is like laughing, poking fun at, or something like that. And you'll see how the rabbis develop it. So Hagar gets her full title here. Why is she identified specifically as the Egyptian? We know that her son Yishmael, who is much older than Yitzchak, is doing something with him that uses the word metzachek, that often means to laugh or to make fun of, and that, that we'll come back to that. And then again, Sarah says to kick her out. And now the first time she kicked out Hagar, she just kicked out Hagar, pregnant young woman, and now she kicks her out with her young son. Now, obviously, we know that in both cases, ultimately Hagar and her son will be okay, but there's a lot of residual damage that we'll develop and look at by the end of this class, is kicking them out. Even though God said, I'll protect you, make you a great nation, the fact that Sarah kicked them out, we're still dealing with the consequences in many ways. And the last piece of data that we have from here is specifically, as Sarah says, why is she kicking her out? Because of the inheritance. Lo yirash, he will not inherit, ben ha'ama hazot, the son of this handmaiden, im beni, with my son, with Yitzchak. And again, she says both. She doesn't say with Yitzchak or just with my son. The Torah is very careful with the words, with my son, the true son, who is named Yitzchak. So inheritance is a part here. So Hagar is identified as an outsider. Her much older son is doing something with Yitzchak, and Sarah is concerned about the inheritance. And now what we're going to do is look at how the rabbis pick up on these different clues to figure out, why was Sarah so angry? Did she have a right to be concerned? Or is this just a continued jealous rivalry? So any questions before we get into the rabbinic ideas and responses? Excellent. So Isabel, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this next source here, we're not going entirely in a chronological order. So this is Rashbam in the 12th century France. He is actually the grandson of Rashi. And he typically tries to not bring in outside ideas and midrash. He looks at the text and tries to get a simple understanding of it. And the biggest clue we have here about Sarah's concern is the inheritance. So Isabel, please, source number 2.
In the meantime, Ishmael was already 16 years old. Sarah did not want him to remain in the same household any longer, so that he would not get any ideas about sharing any inheritance with Yitzhak.
Excellent, beautiful. Now we could end there. And there are many rabbis either mention that idea or say that is the correct reading. And they obviously have very strong proof, because Sarah says this is the reason she's kicking her out, because of the inheritance. However, there's one other thing that is not being discussed in this particular comment by the Rashbam, and that is, what was Yishmael doing? What was that metzachek thing? Now, we'll see again, the rabbis, some of them will actually connect it to the inheritance, but one of the things that we saw already is the way that the word metzachek is translated is playing. So what's the deal with an older brother playing? My daughter is 6 years older than our younger son, Jacob. So it's not 16 years, but there's nothing wrong with an older, when you have families of 13 kids and the oldest one is 25 and the youngest one is 2, no one thinks it's inappropriate for the older one to play. There's nothing wrong with playing. But here's the issue. The word, in Hebrew, you have root letters, 3 letters usually, sometimes 4, and depending on how you use them, both context context and the way you form the word. Just like you have English, you have prefixes and suffixes, and you can use them in different ways to change the meaning. Same thing in Hebrew. And from the context and based on other sources, this word probably does not mean playing games. He probably wasn't playing Parcheesi with him. So the first, not the first person, but someone who picks up on that fact very well. And why would Sarah be concerned about her half stepson or whatever it is like that, playing with a little kid? That's so adorable, right? Something else must have been going on. So a contemporary scholar, Robert Alter, who has written a number of books on how to translate the Torah, an incredible magnum opus on a translation with amazing comments on how to understand the language and the context. Really, if you have never read any of Robert Alter's works, pick up a copy. It's brilliant, readable, beautiful. So he has a little comment on this verse. So Jane, if you would please read for us number 3, and this is from Robert Alter's translation of the 5 books of Moses from 2004. He's updated and expanded it since then, but go ahead, given the fact, please.
Given the fact that she is concerned lest Ishmael encroach on her son's inheritance, and given the inscription of her son's name in this crucial verb, we may also be invited to construe it as Isaacing it. That is, Sarah sees Ishmael presuming to play the role of Isaac, child of laughter, presuming to be the legitimate heir.
Excellent. So already he's starting to play with what the word Yitzchak means here, not as playing, but he's trying to be Yitzchak, i.e. the one who is the reason that Abraham is so excited about Yitzchak is, in his eyes, that is the true heir. Ishmael is a son who he can love and everything like that, but he's not, he is his son, but he's not really and God will say explicitly, Ishmael will be fine, but Yitzchak is the one who I'm going to pass down, the tradition of our people all the way to Jane and Gloria and everything like that. So Ishmael, and it's very sad and tragic and painful, as again, we'll explore later in the class, but Ishmael is not the real descendant. Yitzchak is, and one could read the words Yitzchak and tie those two things together, the inheritance and metzachek, as Ishmael was trying to be Yitzchak. It's a very clever play on words, and the fact that we see the Torah use the word Yitzchak and metzachek, it's clear that the story is doing puns and playing on words. We have this also when jumping ahead in the future of the Torah with Jacob, Yaakov, when he fights with the Ish, the godly being by the river. It uses the word, his name is Yaakov, and he's fighting this being by the river, Yaabok, and he is, what's the word for it? It's also another version of Ekev, of that thing, and he has a Ekev kicking up dust. So he uses 3 versions of it. So the Torah clearly loves puns, whether they're meant to be clever or to teach a lesson. In this next source here, in the 19th century Italy, and Jane, I'll let you take this one as well, also tries to connect that word metzachek with the inheritance concern. Go ahead, please.
Ishmael was mocking Sarah because by giving birth to a son, his own inheritance from his father was diminished.
So already here, we're getting away from just cute playing to the idea that metzachek is laughing at him. And not literally just like, haha, but like kind of poking at him and making fun of him and mocking, as they said, mocking here, because Ishmael's concern is, oh boy, there's another boy. Now my inheritance will be diminished. And it will not, I'm not going to get my full thing. So I don't like this kid. And Sarah was concerned that this kind of behavior would continue and get worse to the point where you'd almost have like a Yaakov and Esav kind of rivalry, where, they almost end up trying to kill each other and selling their birthright and all that kind of stuff. And Sarah said, I don't want any of that. Yitzchak gets the full inheritance. Ishmael needs to be out of the picture. Now, the inheritance is clearly a concern here. But one of the things that's difficult is the word metzachek. They are all translated as mocking or laughter. But again, we have contexts in other parts of the Torah where the word metzachek means something very, very different. And what you have in this next source is in the 13th century Spain, Ramban. Now, one of the greatest things about, or the great things about Ramban, besides that his commentary is brilliant and insightful, and also one of the greatest sources of Jewish mysticism connected with the Torah, he also is great at summarizing early opinions. He often responds directly to Rashi and another rabbi, Avraham ibn Ezra, and Rambam, Maimonides as well, and he often brings in other sources. So this source number 5, Gloria, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, will give us a summary of all of the rabbinic opinions from the Talmud up through Ramban's time about how rabbis understood the word metzachek. Because again, if you look at other ways it's used in the Torah, it has a very, very different meaning. And the first one here is talking about worshiping idols, and Gloria will read in a second. And just to explain where they got that from, in the story of the golden calf, when it described the people having built the golden calf, it said they built the golden calf, they offered to it, and then they went back and they continued to letzachek. So the question is, does that mean they were having a wild, funny, silly party, or letzachek in that context meant worshiping that idol in sort of a joyous manner? So based on that, go ahead, Gloria, this refers to.
Metzachek, making sport. This refers to the worshiping idols, murder, and sexual immorality. He, Ishmael, quarreled with Isaac about inheritance, saying, I am the firstborn and will take a double portion. They then went into the field, and Ishmael took his bow and shot arrows at Isaac. Just as you say, as a madman who casteth firebrands, arrows, and death, so is the man who deceives his neighbor and says, am I not in sport? It is from Sarah's complaint to Abraham, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir, etc., that you learn that they were quarreling about the inheritance. All this is Rashi's language.
So one of the things that's going to happen here is, you remember last week, Hagar, according to Sarai or to Sarah, was being very haughty because she was pregnant and, standing above her station. So it was Hagar's fault that she got kicked out. But here, if Ishmael is innocently playing and Hagar hasn't done anything at all, then Sarah has no right to want to have them kicked out. So what the rabbis are doing here, and again, we'll see they actually have a lot of evidence there, is maybe Hagar didn't do anything here. It didn't say that she was asking about the inheritance. The one who may have done something here is Yishmael, but only if the word metzachek has negative connotations. If he's playing with his little brother, that's horrible for Sarah to kick them out. But if he's if he's molesting his brother or making fun of him or worshiping idols, as I said from those different contexts, then Yishmael is the villain here. And the concern is that he'll continue in that way, and better to kick him and his mom out. So what Ramban is going to do here is he's going to go back now to the Talmud and how the rabbis propose each of these different understandings of what Ishmael may have been doing with his little brother Yitzchak. So Gloria, please continue. Here too.
Here too, the rabbi writes all the different opinions mentioned in the following. Quote, we have been taught, Rabbi Shimon, the son of Eliezer, said, there are 4 interpretations of Rabbi Akiva, which I interpret differently, and my interpretation seems more acceptable than his. Rabbi Akiva interpreted, quote, and Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne unto Abraham, making sport. Making sport is but a designation for idolatry, etc.
Pause for a moment. So that, again, his source for that is because that word, letzachek, is used in the context of the golden calf. But what's really cool right now, and I love this, is they're going to go through each opinion and then essentially reject them until Ramban has what he thinks is the right one. So this is how he says, Yishmael was probably not playing with his little brother and worshiping idols. Why? But I say, heaven forbid that such be in the house of the righteous one. Is it possible that he, of whom it is written, for I have known him, to the end that he may command his children and his household, etc., will have in his household idolatry, sexual immorality, and murder? Making sport mentioned here is but a designation for the inheritance. So pause for a moment. So what this rejection of that Ramban is saying is, look, you're never going to have idolatry in the house of Abraham. Literally, his entire mission in this world is to wipe out idolatry and bring monotheism. So even though Yishmael ultimately does not become the inheritor of of our people, he's still raised by Abraham. It doesn't matter that his mom is technically Hagar the Egyptian. Hagar lives in a house of monotheism. And Abraham, even though it gets very tricky and and family issues, and that Avram essentially rejects his son Yishmael, he still raises him. And he's not going to raise a boy who's going to worship idols. So he says, no, this is totally about the inheritance. So it can continue, please. When Isaac was born.
But can I just ask a question?
Of course.
Or how could it be a designation for inheritance unless Ishmael is teasing Isaac? I'm going to get more money than you, or
read the next line. When Isaac was born.
Okay. When Isaac was born and everyone rejoiced, Ishmael said to them, "Fools, I am the firstborn, and I take a double portion." From the complaint of our mother Sarah to Abraham, you learn that making sport refers to the inheritance. And my interpretation seems more acceptable than that of Rabbi Akiva.
There's a lot of chutzpah there to say I'm better than Rabbi Akiva, but that is, again, the context, the simplest understanding of it. It's about the inheritance, and somehow it's related to inheritance, does make a lot of sense. But the rabbis, again, that word metzachek, playing, it's just a peculiar word to use there. And again, it's clearly playing on things of, whether it's Yitzchak's name. And I don't know if it'll come up, but I will mention that when I keep talking about this sexual immorality and the implication that Yishmael may not just have been either worshiping idols or making fun of his brother, but may have been molesting him sexually, is in the story of Yosef. After Yosef does not accept, so he's working in the house of Potiphar, and Potiphar's wife comes on to Yosef and tries to seduce him, and he says no. Potiphar's wife is mad and decides to get Yosef in trouble. So she says to her husband, he came on to me and he was trying to letzachek with me. That same word used in a slightly different, variation, how it's conjugated, but the same word there clearly is he was trying to sleep with me. And another one is, again, later in the Torah about Yitzchak. Yitzchak and his wife Rivka, just like his father, or I guess go back, Avram and Sarah in last week's Parasha were wandering around. They came upon the Pharaoh at the time. Avram was worried that the Pharaoh would kidnap Sarah, sleep with her, and perhaps kill Avraham. So Avraham lied and said, no, she's my sister. Well, like father, like son, later in the Torah, Yitzchak and Rivka, the same thing, are going to go by the king Avimelech, and he's going to lie and say, oh, I'm the brother, so that you don't kill me to get my beautiful wife, Rivka. There's a lot of beautiful women in the Torah. But then Avimelech sees that Rivka and Yitzchak are sachaking, they're playing around. And again, from the context, it basically means that Avimelech either walked in on incest and a brother and sister sleeping together, or he realized they're not brother and sister. The way that whatever they're doing right now, that's a husband and wife, and the truth comes out. There's actually a lot of times that the word sachak, to be playing around, has sexual connotation. Just like the Hebrew word leda'at, to know, can mean, oh, I have general knowledge, but can also be to know someone in a carnal sexual sense. So that flexibility of Hebrew in the Torah is clearly being both taken advantage of by the rabbi, and it's clear that it's the word in the verses that we saw, when Yishmael was metzacheking with Yitzchak, I think it was meant for us to kind of pick up on that something not so funny is going on here. Excellent. So we continue on the expression of the rabbi.
The expression of the rabbi that Ishmael quarreled with Isaac about the inheritance also does not appear correct, for if so, this must have happened much later when Isaac was grown up, and Ishmael would then have been too big for his mother to carry him on her shoulder. Our rabbis have also said that Ishmael was 17 years old at the time he left his father's house. So if so, this happened at the time when Isaac was weaned, and Isaac was thus too young for Ishmael to quarrel with him about the inheritance.
So if they're at the age where they can actually like tease each other, that doesn't work out, because that could only have worked later when Yitzchak was older. And we know at the time, and it does seem to make sense from the context of the Torah, and certainly all rabbinic opinions, that the age difference was huge. So that would basically be saying that Ishmael was, poking fun and teasing a baby. And that just, again, now you could have that. Maybe like Sarah walked in You see this again in films where someone, sees a baby who's going to be the true inheritor of the throne. They whisper, be like, "You won't see another day." And obviously the baby doesn't understand it, but it's for them to say. But Ramban is saying that doesn't make sense. What does it mean that for them to actually play together playfully in cute little bouncing, on the knee games? That makes sense. But that they're teasing each other, you can't tease a baby who's a couple months old. So he brings in one more opinion, and then he's going to share what he thinks is the correct one. So he brings in, as I mentioned, Ibn Ezra. He generally brings in Rashi, Ibn Ezra, and then typically a few others. So please, Gloria, Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra.
Yeah, Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra said, in line with the literal interpretation of scripture, that mitzahech means playing, as is normal for every boy. And she was jealous of him because he was bigger than her son.
So Rabbi Ibn Ezra's, Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra's here just takes it at face value, saw them playing together. Now, the way he interprets it, though, there was nothing wrong with that. Again, it's an older brother playing with his little baby brother. So depending on how you interpret this, in one version, Yishmael is the bad guy, but in Ibn Ezra's, the bad guy, as it were, is definitely Sarah, and letting her jealousy, as he says explicitly, get the best of her. And it doesn't even make it about, and even if it is about the inheritance, that's still not okay. That is not ethical to do so. So most of these interpretations put the onus on Sarah, and that she made a mistake. And then Avraham said, okay, whatever you want, honey. Or God actually tells Avraham, do whatever you want. So now Ramban is going to share his interpretation, which is a variation on ideas we've seen. Please.
The correct interpretation appears to me to be that this event took place on the day that Isaac was weaned, and Sarah saw Ishmael mocking Isaac with a great feast.
Just pause there for a moment. Just the distinction there, Isaac or the great feast, is they had a party. So Ishmael came in and be like, oh, this, either he was saying, oh, that my stupid baby brother, it's, he's going to take away some of my inheritance. Or he said, oh, this stupid feast, this baby doesn't deserve a feast. So he's saying it was either one of those things, but both are inappropriate if that's what he did. Please continue.
It is for this reason that the verse says, and Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, rather than Ishmael, making sport. Similarly, she said, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for she said, the slave who mocks his master is deserving of death or stripes, but I want only that you cast him out from before me, and that he should in no way inherit your belongings together with my son, who is the son of the mistress. She also told Abraham to cast out his mother, as the boy was unable to leave her, for he would die if he were to leave his mother.
So I guess that little sensitivity there is, this boy is going to be a problem, but I'm not going to send him out to die, so I'll send the mother with him. But even Ramban's correct interpretation, he sort of undermined it earlier when he said Yishmael's not really, either he's too old to be making fun of a baby, I guess, or he's making fun of the feast, or he's too young to, it just doesn't really work out unless the issue here is, again, not Yishmael, but Hagar. And he does point out the issue here is Sarah's son, Hagar, the Egyptian, the outsider, remembering that she is an outsider, and she's going to look out for her son Ishmael. And that kind of becomes the issue here. Sarah doesn't really have a problem with Hagar. She has a fact with the problem that Hagar has a son who has a claim to the throne, as it were. And the only way to deal with this is to get rid of both of them. Because if she gets rid of Ishmael, Hagar is going to keep trying to bring him back. And if she just gets rid of Hagar, Ishmael is certainly going to get the inheritance. But again, in all of these interpretations, we keep coming back to, this isn't really about what Hagar or Ishmael did. They didn't really deserve to be sent out to basically die. And in this next source here, now in 15th century Italy, and this really makes it about the rivalry, the jealousy of Sarah to Hagar, and not about Ishmael. It's not about what Ishmael did. It's about Sarah's fear or hatred of Hagar. So Leonard, if you'll take source number 6, please. She assumed
that the reason Ishmael had made disparaging remarks about Yitzchak was due to his mother putting him up to it, or to the Egyptian genes of his mother coming into play here. We have a saying in Sukkah 56 that the prattle of children in public reflects either what they picked up from their father or what they picked up from their mother. To the son, to the case in the case of Ishmael, he certainly did not overhear his father make such disparaging remarks.
Excellent, thank you. So that line about the Egyptian genes, which seems pretty racist, it does not appear to be in the Hebrew. So this is a translation from, like, you know, a publicly available site. I'm not sure why they did that in there. But again, now this is putting it again on between Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael. It's not about him. He was a young boy who was just doing what his mother said. Now, of course, you could say he should have learned better. And, you know, we have the sins of the father thing. It's not that children are punished for the sins of their father. It's just typically children will often continue with the behavior, good or bad, of their parents. So she's saying here that she's concerned that Ishmael will continue to be like Hagar. But again, it makes it about Hagar. So now we go back to last week's parasha, where Hagar did seem to have, or at least it's implied, or at least Sarah's understanding is, that Hagar was being haughty because she was pregnant. But it makes it all about the rivalry between these two women. But ultimately, this is all about Sarah's jealousy. Hagar didn't really do anything wrong. The fact that she did what her mistress said, her mistress, again, who took her out of her homeland to serve her, gave her over to her master, to Abraham, to have a child, to fulfill that command, everything Hagar did. And the fact that she was happy that she could have a child, that's not okay. I'm not going to say that Hagar is perfect, but that's because no one's perfect. Hagar is not the villain of the story. It seems like Sarah is, and perhaps Avram as well. And if we actually look back in source number 7 here, Jane, I am unmuting you. I didn't mean if we look in source number 7, Jane, I just meant Jane, I am unmuting you.
Yeah.
We go back to Ramban and an earlier thing, actually from last week's parasha, but it's clear that it's referencing this whole issue here. And he basically says that, look, Hagar and Ishmael, they didn't really do anything wrong here, but Sarah and Abraham did. So go ahead, source number 7, please.
Our mother sinned with this abuse, as did Abraham, by letting her do so. And God heard her suffering and gave her a son who would be a wild ass of a man to make the seed of Abraham and Sarah suffer all kinds of abuse. That's
a very apt read of this, is that Ishmael, he was kicked out and he was made, you know, the entire Middle East is basic. Obviously, this is, you know, getting into, you know, tradition and myth, et cetera, like that. But from the perspective of the Torah, Ishmael is the ancestor, the father of all the Arab nations. And obviously there are on massive number of conflicts and issues in the Arab world. But strictly speaking, they're doing fine. They are mighty. Israel, this tiny, tiny little nation, that's also, they're doing okay for themselves. But here, and that was kind of like a punishment, a slap in the face to Sarah and Abraham for what they did. They messed up bad here. And even if we go with the rabbinic interpretations that Ishmael was being inappropriate and potentially threatening or molesting his little brother, which is disgusting, Hagar here doesn't deserve to be kicked out. And again, as we've seen, it's unlikely that Ishmael was really doing all of those horrible things. And even if he was teasing his brother, which doesn't make sense to tease a baby, it was more likely he was just playing with him. And then Hagar or Sarah got into his mind, oh my gosh, they're brothers. They are real brothers. They're playing with each other, and brothers split the inheritance. Yes, and the firstborn gets more inheritance. And who's the firstborn? Ishmael. So regardless of which interpretation you go with, to cast out, to exile both Ishmael and Hagar, it just seems awful. And the onus of the story, and again, the rabbis, this is a tension that I've talked about before. I think I talked about it last Shabbat. The rabbis trying to hold people to task, but also to justify their actions and to hold them to task. Some of the rabbis say, no, Sarah was totally in her right. There was idolatry in her house. She had to end it. And the other ones say, no, Sarah messed up and Avraham allowed her to do so. And Ramban says that explicitly. So before we go on to our last source, exploring this in a fascinating way, Susan, I see you have your hand up, so I'm going ahead and unmute you. And you just have to go ahead and unmute yourself. Yeah, go ahead, Susan, please.
Well, of course, I have a lot to say about this, but I just wanted to ask, it's not clear to me who she refers to in this Rambam quotation. God heard her suffering. I thought that was Sarah. Our mother sinned with this abuse. I thought we were talking about Sarah.
Okay, sure. So as Abraham, by letting her
God,
do so, is Sarah. The one who's suffering is Hagar.
Yeah, okay. It's just not clear because it talks about our mother before.
These are the things that make more sense in context when you're actually reading the verses here. Yeah. You know, they come out more smoothly. So the letting her do so is, again, this is last week. So it's where Abraham allowed Sarah to abuse Hagar, and then the one who is suffering is Hagar.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's kind of what I thought, but just the grammar of it confused me.
No. It can definitely be confusing with unreferenced pronouns. Excellent. So we're going to go on to this last source here, and this is a fascinating source that I discovered. It gives there's an article that actually discusses a lot of these sources, and it brought this in. And it's a contemporary poet, I believe Syrian American, Moja Chaf, and she wrote this imagined kind of poetic letter. And the context of it is that Hagar is writing it to Sarah and saying, look, I know you kicked me out and you exiled me, but this rivalry between us needs to end because we started out by being essentially friends. You took me from my home, you took me into your home, I served you as my mistress, but we loved each other. And then what happened? And what's interesting here is that in the story, in the sources we see, the bad guys or bad girls seems to be Sarah, but here Hagar says, no. The bad guy here is really Avraham. He was the one who really had the power to stop this rivalry. He could have gotten involved. He could have resolved so many issues. And not the only context, but this is very much a feminist piece. And it's saying it's the men's fault for doing this. And we, the women, can make peace. Now, this poem here is really a kind of symbol for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And when she's writing it, or the Arab-Jew conflict, however you look at it, she's saying, look, the men have messed this up as bad as it's going to get. So maybe the women are the only ones who can fix it. So let's go back to kind of the original rivalry of the women, to Sarah and Hagar, and see what we have in common, and maybe we can fix this. Maybe there can be a kind of reconciliation. So she begins, "Dear Sarah, life made us enemies, but it doesn't have to be that way. What if we both ditch the old man?" Again, it's very feminist, which is appropriate here because Avraham did allow all this to happen on his watch. He could have visitation rights with the boys, alternate weekends and holidays. Yeah, especially the Feast of the Sacrifice. Everybody has forgotten anyway that it began with me abandoned in the desert, watching my baby dehydrate for days. I dared God to let us die. So she's referencing obviously what happened in this Parasha, being cast out, and she's saying that was horrible. And she's going to say later, you need to own up to that. But you know what? It happened. Anyway, you and I, we'd set up house, raise the kids, start a catering business maybe. You have brains, so do I. We could travel. There are places to see. Besides Ur and this Nowheresville desert with its tribes of hooligans, no. Your lips always thin when you disapprove, like the mother I can hardly remember from before I wound up in your house. And this symbolism here is that Hagar almost sees Sarah as her mother. She basically became her mother who abandoned her. I was barely more than a girl. You are the one who brought me there from Egypt. You used to laugh back then. And again, that play on laughter and how it changed from laughters of joy or laughing the absurdity of miracles to the mocking and the hateful, abusive laughter. In those days, you could bear to look at me. Oh, Sarah, you need years of therapy. Can't you admit what he did to me was cruel? And again, she doesn't put the onus on Sarah totally. She's really blaming Avraham. But then she goes on, admit it for just 1 second. It won't make you hate him forever, just long enough to know the world won't fall apart, long enough to pity him, yourself, me. Laugh, Sarah, laugh, a good, real, genuine laugh. Imagine, God, the possibility. Love Hagar, and there's 2 versions of it where there's love and sincerely, and one of them is crossed out. But here you see this beautiful thing, and this is so true. Imagine if this rivalry that goes back to the Torah, if the 2 sides said, you know what? We both messed up bad and we need therapy. but no one is willing to admit that. And again, this goes back to the rabbinic dialogue of no. Sarah is a righteous woman. She kicked out Ishmael and sent him to die because he was a molesting idolater. Maybe, but it's unlikely. Well, it's because Hagar was haughty. Is that enough to kick her out? So the rabbis struggle here. What if we're, and this is not, in the Torah, we're always the villains, but what if Sarah in this instance was the villain? And what if the Jews were to, and I'm not going to get into the Palestinian-Israeli conflict now, but what if in this relationship, one of the sides who's been taking the high ground forever said, you know what, maybe at one point I was the villain. And look, you also need to admit that you messed up too, but you know what? I was the villain at some point. And that's a very different way of reading the Sarai thing. And again, we have this Ramban here that admits as much, that in this instance, and this does not mean that Avram and Sarai are bad people, but they messed up, just like King David, who was our greatest king. When it came to the story of Bathsheba and him taking her as his lover and sending her husband off to die, that is bad. That is worse than bad. Here, it's more about family conflict, although she does send Ishmael and Hagar to die. But what if in our history, we didn't try and justify every action? What if we admitted our shortcomings? And that actually makes the Torah more powerful, because it makes these people. It makes them human. We can learn something from them. And then if we do apply it to modern conflicts, what if people did admit they were wrong more often? What if people were willing to admit, I am in the wrong here, and we need to work on this. We need therapy or whatever it looks like. That is a very powerful way to read the Torah. And again, it makes Sarah more human and opens the door for healing,